is. There's about a 10, 15-second delay, so I always want to make sure that this is where we always look a little bit. Okay.
Improve the lighting here.
Okay, Danny.
Yes.
Welcome to our Israel update this morning, or afternoon, early afternoon for you and Israel. And Danny, just tell us, just remind everybody who you are and what you do, and why I might want to be talking to you early in the morning.
Good question. I usually say that I have a radio show early morning on an Israeli radio station in Hebrew. So I'm always surprised when somebody says to me, "Oh, I heard your show this morning." I say, "Who gets up at those hours?" So I know what you're saying. Right now, I'm a commentator, an analyst, a media analyst. I have a broadcaster on a radio station in Israel. But my claim to fame, I guess you can call it, was I was a 31-year member of the Israeli government, of the Prime Minister's office, senior member, obviously, at the end of my career there. As a Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Public Diplomacy. And I was also head of the Government Press Office, which is the office in the Prime Minister's office, which handles and works with the foreign press in Israel. And I did that for over 25 years, 10 of those years as the director of the organization.
Okay. So I want to go a couple directions with you. I know you've said a lot about cognitive warfare, so I want to get to that. And we talked a little bit beforehand about the propaganda war, I guess, is the way that I would term it. But before that, I mean, we just passed the 1-year anniversary of October 7. I'm wondering if you would share with us your thoughts about that day.
That's, you know what, we did have the anniversary. We haven't, since we've been at war since then. And our minds are set on that. And it's a very complex and complicated war on 7 different fronts. There was the initial shock of last year, but we really haven't. We had Israel Memorial Day here a few months ago, the day before our Independence Day. So we did have a little time to be somber and remember, but we really haven't set back, because we can't afford to do so at the moment, to mourn and to fully understand what we went through, because we can't dwell on that at the moment. It was such an horrific day. And I sat that morning and watched through Arab social media channels, the material that they were pumping up there, all these things that people are saying now, oh, it never happened. And they were parading, literally parading in the streets, but also parading it on social media, very proud of all the ruthlessness, the horror, the violence, the murder, the rape, the sexual assault, the butchering. If you haven't seen those things, and I know people are saying you should look at it, I would recommend people who are not, it's horrific. It's the worst of what you see on World War II and Nazi and beyond. Because it's also, there's an element of joy and festivity among the assailants. And it's not only them yelling, Allahu Akbar, God is great, which is like the only religion that in times of horror cheer God, or at least their God, because I know it's not our God. And they take pleasure in what they're doing. So 1,200 Israelis were murdered and butchered on that day. We've had 400 and some soldiers who have fallen since, and we've had other people murdered in terrorist attacks and the violence coming directed at us from Lebanon since then. But that day itself is unique in the history of the state of Israel, though I have to stress it's not unique in the history of the Jewish people, because this is more or less what the Jews have gone through in the 2,000 years of the diaspora since being expelled from the land of Israel. Every so often you had these pogroms, or these acts of violence directed against Jews. And looking back on these events, and some of them are historically known, such as the expulsion from Spain in 1492. And there were times in Arab countries during the Holocaust in Europe when the Arabs in Iraq assaulted the Jews who had lived with them for over 1,000 years. You had events in Poland and in Russia. None of these events had the number of casualties as we experienced here in Israel on October 7th. That's how horrific it was numerically. And the whole purpose of the state of Israel, besides the fact of the return of the Jewish people, was that we're here, this no longer happens, and it happened to us in the state of Israel. So that was the initial shock of last year. I went back to look at some of the footage, and there was new footage released in the past few days before October 7th. And I've seen some things in my life. I fought as a paratrooper in the war, in the first Lebanon War back in 1982. I participated in operations as part of my job working with the foreign media when you had the terrorist attacks here in Israel back in the early 2000s. I was at the location of every terrorist attack and saw the mangled and butchered bodies there. I've seen things. And what I saw with that was so disturbing, I lost sleep. I don't want to be descriptive, but when you see the acts of violence against children, against babies, and I have to say against the unborn, as a woman is screaming on a table and she is muscled down by 4, 5, 6 men, and they put tape over her mouth so she will stop screaming. And they cut open her stomach and pull out the unborn baby who is now brought in, not to our world, but into hell. And they then pummel with their fists. They pummel the newly born, the newly extracted child. He was not born. He was extracted from the stomach of his mother. And when you see these pictures, you understand who we're dealing with and what we're dealing with. And all those people celebrating in the streets and saying to us, oh, there won't be one. And I'm quoting from demonstrations in the United States. There will not be one October 7th, not 10 October 7th, not additional 100 October 7th, not 1,000. There will be 10,000 October 7th against Israel. We listen to them and we hear them because many of them, they didn't use October 7th, but what they did on October 7th, they said they would do to us given the opportunity. And they were cheering in the streets of Gaza on October 7th. When they brought in bodies of Israeli soldiers and Israeli civilians that they kidnapped, they were beating those bodies in the streets, cheering around it. And when they brought in live hostages, they were beating them and cheering it in the streets of Gaza. And 6,000 Gazans, I'm not talking right now about the terrorists, 6,000 Gazans crossed over the fences that were torn down into these towns and villages and kibbutzim in Israel, places that many of them were given homes, were given jobs. The families there drove their children, they're sick. The ones who were with cancer drove them to hospitals in Israel. And they knew this. And yet they came and they pillaged and they beat and they murdered Israeli civilians, and not only Israelis. There were black Africans there because of the kibbutzim. They came to study from the kibbutzim, the agriculture, to go back and improve their towns and villages in Africa. And you can't mistake him for an Israeli. He's a black African, does not speak Hebrew. His English has a very distinct African accent. And they beat him and they shoot him, taking pleasure in it. And they murdered Israeli Arabs. They murdered East Jerusalem Arabs who were there on a trip of elderly after they murdered the elderly in the bus. They take this Arab driver who's speaking Arabic to them and saying he's a Palestinian from East Jerusalem. They shot him dead. They didn't care. And they murdered Thai workers from the fields in the kibbutzim and Filipinos. What does this have to do with occupation? How is this resistance? How is beating and burning children alive resistance? How is raping and physically assaulting in the most unimaginable ways so sick and perverted? How is that resistance? How can anybody in the Western world who claims to be for human rights and claims to be for civil rights. How can they join these despicable? I can't even put, they're not animals because animals don't behave this way. They are satanic, perverted, sick, not even human beings. They are products of Satan, and they're around the world right now, and they're cheered in the streets in the United States and in Europe, and there is nothing, this is even more despicable than the ones cheering in the streets of Gaza. So that's what happened on October 7th, and we do not forget that. And we said for years, never again. And when we said never again, we didn't mean that you would stand around and have Memorial Days honoring us and honoring the Jewish people. No. Never again is that if you ever mess with Israel, there will be consequences. And therefore, there are consequences now for what is happening. Because this was not just some eruption of emotion. This was planned, premeditated, with the attempt of annihilating the existence of the state of Israel, orchestrated by the extreme Islamic jihadist regime of Iran, supported financially by Qatar, who spends a lot of money on your universities and spends a lot of money in the United States. And they are the greatest supporters of jihadists. And jihad, they say very clearly, first come the Saturday people, which are the Jews, then come the Sunday people. When they cheer in Iran, they say Mag, Mag. Mag in Persian. I say Afghani because my family are from Afghanistan, same dialect of Persian. Mag is death. They yell death to Israel and death to the United States. Don't make the same mistake that people here in Israel did. The mistake here was, oh, they don't really mean that. That's part of their culture. They mean it. If they're saying death to America, they will do it. It's part of Islam. And people tend to forget that the Arabic conquest, the Islamic Muslim conquest in Europe and in North Africa and in Asia, they were an empire. They still see themselves as an empire. And they want to restore that empire. Their language is very simple. There's Dar el-Islam, the land of Muslims, and there's Dar el-Harb. Harb is the sword, the land of sword. Any land that is not controlled by Muslims is the land of the sword, the land of conflict, the land of war. Places that they occupied before, in Spain, in Eastern Europe, they intend to go back to because it's their land. They don't call Spain, Spain. They call it Andalusia, which is the Muslim word for that area there. So they intend to do it. And they've invaded Europe. They're invading the United States. We made the mistake of giving them attributes similar to our own, that we believe that they're like us. That is the condescending Western attitude. They have their own culture, their own beliefs, their own system, their own history that they respect and they intend to follow through on. And we have a responsibility to understand this. What happened on October 7th was not only a red alert for Israelis, it was for the entire Judeo-Christian Western civilization. They are coming for all of us. So perform what they did to us to everybody else. And that's what we learned on October 7th.
So Danny, you talked about a 7-front war. So we have Gaza, we have Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Yemen, and Judea Samaria. But I've contended that it's maybe more than a 7-front war because there's a cognitive war. There's a propaganda war that goes on. And I want to talk a little bit to you about that. Because as I mentioned previously, I open my Twitter feed and there's people on there that I follow because I get good information from them. But I don't know if people are trying to discourage me or train me or whatever, in something else. But it is a sewer of Israel and Jew hatred. It is unbelievable. I never thought I would ever see anything like this in my life. and the spin, nobody from Gaza killed anybody. It was IDF soldiers mowing them down under the Hannibal directive or some nonsense that they've come up with. And I have a red alert app, and even as we've been speaking here, it's going off like every minute with
I see it
rockets and missile attacks. And I've talked to friends in Israel, and I hope to get over there soon. But it's tough living under this constant barrage. So let's talk about the cognitive war and how it needs to be fought, maybe how we can help and that sort of thing.
Before addressing that, let me just
sure
here. There's October 7th and now October 8th, and certainly October 8th a year later. I just have to stress this. Yes, we were caught off guard. We were caught by surprise. It was very disturbing. There was a lot of concern those first days. When people say that we use the military, use the Hannibal, military didn't operate that day. What happened on October 7th was civilians, Israeli. Now, we have mandatory service here, so we're all experienced. But Israelis went to the field and went to save their brothers and sisters. And it took the army a few days to organize and get its act together. But since then, what happened was that the Israeli people rose to the occasion. I say that our generation, whether we were right wing or left wing, it doesn't matter. We failed our children and our grandchildren. We failed this generation. All these visions of peace and making concessions and believing that if we just recognized the PLO, there'd be peace. And if we ceded territory, things that were said back in the 70s and 80s, there'll be peace. It was done. I have no problem with that being done. It's when we saw that they were lying to us that we never stopped it. And we let this situation, it was sort of a water warming up, and we ignored it. We were like the frog in the proverbial kettle being slowly cooked. But we did something right because we brought up these kids in the right way with a strong identity, a strong understanding of who we are and what the state of Israel means. And these kids were above and beyond anything we could have imagined. Many of these wonderful young men and women lost their lives in the battlefield, but many more are fighting. There are people in the reserves who their whole lives have been uprooted because they're 100, 120, half a year on reserves. They lost their jobs. They've lost, families, children are being brought up with the father not being home. The women have the whole burden of raising the family. These things affect the life here. And then you also have the missiles falling and the attacks happening. And every child here experiences that. Some to one degree, others depending on how you direct them, but not everybody knows because you're afraid yourself. And you're trying to keep, a straight face and so the kids don't get too nervous. And I mention this because on the other side, you see that we continue a very normal life here. And if you're going to the cognitive warfare, when they talk about what they want to do to Israel and what they've done to Israel, yes, they've hurt us, but they haven't done a thing. Our life continues. I was just walking down the street a few days before October 7th, traffic jams all over. And I mentioned that, not that traffic jams is a good thing, but it's a sign of normal life. People continuing to carry on with their lives. And from time to time, they'll run to a shelter if necessary. Last week, when we had the missile assault from Iran, I made sure my kids were in the back room. We don't have a shelter. And they flew over us. So my understanding of how these things work, I was confident enough to stand on the balcony and watch it. It was a very beautiful image of it. It looked like fireworks, but I knew they were passing overhead. So we didn't have what to concern, but I'm not a genius. So I keep my kids. I may be stupid for myself, but I make sure the kids are in the back room. we go through this constantly. And I can know that the people in the south, and now it's the people in the north of Israel, and I know this from the south from my own family. My nieces and nephews, who are now in their mid-20s, were children who grew up with PTSD because of the constant missile attacks. And now they have kids themselves. And these 2-year-old kids are also exhibiting the same signs. This is not a normal life. This is not how a country should be expected to operate. No country in the world would allow that to happen. And yet this has become the norm here in Israel for too long. And in each one of these times, we had almost 19 years since we left the Gaza Strip. And there were 17 rounds of violence with Hamas since then. 17 rounds. And every round, we were pressured internationally to stop. And the public, the people in the South said, no, finish the job. Each time, the people were willing to continue suffering the missiles, suffering the attacks, suffering everything, just to put an end to it. And it never happened until now. And this is what they're demanding. Now, the government, for many reasons and for many years, and different governments, and not necessarily one or another politician, I'm not blaming them, for many different reasons, didn't do it. This time, after October 7th, we couldn't. We had to do what is in our own best interest. Unfortunately, in the months since, even our allies are giving in to a lot of the propaganda going on. And there are two things here, and I mentioned it before, that are not different. Jews have always been under attack. Jews have always been vilified. And Jews were never was it acceptable for Jews to defend themselves. And you see the same patterns happening now, only the proverbial Jew is the state of Israel. We're not accepting this time. It's the public in Israel. Don't don't listen to the Israeli media, who are very big influence on the foreign media who are here. And there's a very strong connection between this American administration and the Israeli media. They're working together. And that since the beginning, since around November of last year, they've been trying to pressure Israel into not doing certain things, warning us of all these experts telling us if we go into this place in Gaza, there'll be so many casualties. If we do this, if we go into Lebanon, if we take out members of Hezbollah, none of their predictions came through. On the contrary, the moment we were strong, the moment we showed conviction, we defeated them soundly. And this government in Israel knew that. Every civilian in Israel was aware of this for years. So what is happening is that finally the government is doing what the people in Israel wanted to do. But unfortunately, you have the media here, and I worked with them for many years. I wrote a book last year of my experiences. It was called, the title of it is Israel and the Foreign Media, which is a very bland title. I wanted to call the book The Cradle of Fake News. Nobody wanted to publish that title. Because what I saw here, and being the cradle of the three monotheistic religions, you saw here, it wasn't just the failures of the media. It was the deliberate abuse of privilege, meaning given access, given the respect of a Western country, a democracy, which upholds standards of journalism and respects media. May not always like it, but they understand that media is part of our society, while facing dictatorships and terrorist organizations, brutal, vicious terrorist organizations, who dictate to these journalists how they should or should not behave. And yet they never brought this information, which they are committed to. They're obligated to inform civilians because they're providing us. They're the fourth estate in a democracy. They're supposed to be serving the public, just like every one of the other estates, just like the judicial. They're supposed to be providing us, the public, so we can make educated decisions on things. They not only do not inform us, all of us, because I say all of us today because it doesn't matter if it's BBC or ABC or New York Times, because we're all exposed to it today. Today we can all, once you used to have to go to a bookstore or to one of these paper stands and purchase it. You had to have access or be abroad to see television and see the news. Today, It's all on our computers. We can see it all. We're exposed to it all. And this has been the way it's been for over a decade now. They never told you that they had to hire specific people. If they wanted to have a camera crew or a particular journalist working for them or an assistant, they had to be people who were assigned to them by Hezbollah or Hamas or the PLO or the Islamic Jihad or the Kingdom of Jordan or the Egyptian government. They had to have camera crews that were locals that were assigned to work with these crews and dictated to them what they can and what they cannot film and show. The journalists never told you that. And when I brought it to the attention, for example, of Reuters, that some of their members in Gaza are members of Hamas because we had the intelligence. If people ask us, how do you do that? How do you know that? How did we know who were carrying beepers of Hezbollah? So if we knew that, and I'm not saying that we did anything about it because nobody knows who blew up those beepers. It may have been a malfunction in the creation of those beepers in Lebanon. Who knows? But we certainly know who's a member of Hamas because they don't hide that stuff. There are lists of these people on their organizations because they get paid by them. And all the money that you're giving through your taxpaying dollars, you and in Europe, that are going to the Palestinians in Gaza or in Judea and Samaria even, it's controlled by the leadership there. So we know who are the members. So when I said this to Reuters, they said, no, our journalists uphold the professional standards. So professional standards mean that they have a car that has TV written on it, on the roof, so we see it with their helicopters or we see it with our binoculars. It has TV on it, but they're transporting armed terrorists from one location to the other. These are things that happened. Or their cameraman who works for them in Judea and Samaria, and they sent him because eventually we said, yeah, let him go. We don't want him here. They wanted him to cover for Reuters during the American invasion in Iraq, and they wanted him to cover events there. And he pulled with the Americans the same kind of things he pulled with the Israelis. And I mention this because he was shot and killed by the American forces in an area, I don't remember right now in what area in Iraq. His name was Mazen Dana, and you can look him up. He was shot and killed by the Americans. And when I called up the American embassy here in Israel to tell them, listen, just so you know who this guy is, I spoke to the military attaché here. And he laughed at me and said, Danny, yeah, we know all of that stuff. Listen, we don't care who he was. He was engaging our troops. He paid a price. Now that is acceptable to Americans. If Israel did this, till this day, we're being accused of killing quote unquote journalists. So you have all of this happening and they know, the organizations know, CNN and New York Times and Reuters, they all know. And I can just tell you, when Mazen Dana was brought, we allowed him to be brought, his body to be brought back here to be buried in Hebron. And when people walked in, you had the heads of Hamas in Hebron coming to the family to pay their respects. And when they walked into the house, there was the Israeli flag and the American flag on which they wiped their feet. We have footage of this in our security and our intelligence. Military intelligence has footage of this happening. The moment the heads of Reuters came, they removed it. And they asked all the members of Hamas to leave. So they continued with the charade. But we were observing the house, so we know all of this. So these are the kind of things that happen. And when this happens, then you can quickly realize that we're at a tremendous disadvantage when it comes to the cognitive warfare. Now, I can tell you beyond that, Iran and other proxies of the jihadists, of the Islamic Jihad, the Muslim Brotherhood, as I said before, the greatest funders of the Muslim Brotherhood is Qatar. They went into universities in the United States, creating these outreach centers for Middle East, making sure that only people who they approve of can be members. They pay a lot of money. Now, the other thing with this is in the United States, universities write the curriculum for high schools in their regions. And I know all of this because my first job back in 1983 in the Israeli consulate in New York was working with academia in the United States. And we discover all this money being put in from different Arab countries to American universities. And we see the results today, 40 years later. We see how they've succeeded in brainwashing. For Iran, the goal was, since that time, delegitimize the Jewish right to self-determination. Jews do not have a right to self-determination. Zionism is a colonialist, racist term. And they're using all of this. So when you're getting it from the media and you're getting it from academia, we're supposed to be the top levels of intelligentsia in any Western society. What you do see, though, especially when it comes to the United States, is the average Joe, if you want to use that term, they usually have more common sense. The same way as it happens here in Israel, the average person usually has a lot more common sense than the average journalist or the average academic. And they're not influenced there, but what they see with their own eyes and what they understand, and they understand very clearly, it's not that complex. There's good and there's evil. If you're a decent human being, you know what good is. If you're not decent, you don't understand what evil is. You don't understand it when you see it. You make excuses for it. You try to justify it. And that's what's happening. The cognitive warfare is, in very simple terms, is good, the battle of good versus evil. Nothing new about that. It goes back to biblical times. And it's amazing. And I quote one last sentence here. I quote Einstein often. And by the way, with the advent of social media, I checked to make sure he actually did. But Einstein said that coincidence is God's way of keeping anonymous. And you have so many coincidences here and so many things happening. And I think I've said this before when we were interviewed. When I see here in Jerusalem, and I remember the scriptures of how they said that will come the day when the elderly will sit in the streets of Jerusalem and the children will play before them. And I see this happening today throughout Jerusalem and Israel. Who am I to argue? We're living what the prophets prophesied in the Bible in those times. And the Bible is as relevant today as it was 2,000, 3,000 years ago. Because when it comes down to it, the greatest thing for humans is the battle between good and evil. And we're in the midst of it right now.
So I sit here and I watch the news from Israel. I watch the news from America. I mean, there's plenty of bad news out there. As we were beginning before we went live on the air, you looked over your computer screen. There's a stabbing in Hadera up near, I think that's around Tel Aviv. And
just north of Tel Aviv.
I think there's 6 people injured. The terrorist has been eliminated. But then, last week where you were dealing with the largest ballistic missile attack by one country against another in human history. I mean, this is unprecedented. And shortly, I think, was it shortly thereafter, there was a terrorist attack in Jaffa,
about an hour before the missile attack.
I guess my question is, how do you deal with that, and how do we help you deal with that?
Well, to more give you a better insight on this, I have a son who is a combat soldier with the paratroopers. He served in Gaza, volunteered to continue extend his mandatory service, and he fought in the war there with the paratroopers. Very proud of it. It was in the unit that I was a member of years ago. And he completed his service, and now he has reserve duty. And again, he's in the same reserve unit that I was in the paratroopers, and now he's up north in Lebanon. And he's fighting there. 40 years after I fought in Lebanon, never believed that my son would be doing the same thing. And I mention this because when you have that concern, I also have a daughter in the military, and she's with the Golani Infantry Brigade. And she's a social worker. She works with the soldiers to help them with their personal problems. And since everybody's mandatory service, a lot of people come from homes that need assistance, and the military assists their families. But then 3 days ago, well, on one hand, I have a son on the border and fighting in Lebanon right now. My daughter is supposed to be safe here in Israel. She was on the way to Beersheba after visiting one of the families in the south. And they were going to eat McDonald's at the bus station in Beersheba. And at the last moment, they were turned around because they were informed minutes before they arrived there that there was a terrorist attack in the bus station in Beersheba, and a border police woman was shot and killed. Several others were injured. So while I'm concerned about my son in Lebanon, here it is. I wasn't even thinking about it. And my daughter could have been in similar danger, and in many ways, worse situation, because at least I know my son and his friends and buddies there can defend themselves. And here, that's what we're dealing with here. But that's what we've been dealing with for years. And that's what we've been dealing with. And I mentioned before that I experienced all the suicide bombings and things. I didn't have children back in the early 2000s when you had all the suicide bombings. Now my children are on buses and traveling around. And I think, how did people I worked with who had children that were going around the center of town or traveling on public transportation, how were they not going mad those days? And I see how quickly, I hate public transportation, I walk. My kids use it, and it's like second nature. And this has been our life. And I stress this has been our life for another reason. We always grew up here with stories. Everybody talks about the Holocaust, but every one of our families, regardless of where they came from, and I can use my own personal family story from my mother's side, who immigrated from Afghanistan, and how my grandfather became the head of the Afghan, or my great-grandfather at that time, over 100 years ago, became the head of the Afghan community because it was Yom Kippur, and they had very good relations with they were advisors to the king, the Jews there, so they were protected. This is when they were protected. And they were in the Yom Kippur ceremony in Afghanistan, in Herat. And the head of the community steps outside to get some air during the day, and his head, literally, his head is rolled in. They never found the body. And he was executed. And then my great-grandfather was appointed as the head of the community at that time. Every one of our families, regardless of where we originated from, have those kind of stories. And it was very interesting because when I fought in Lebanon, I was in a town in Bahamdon, in the mountains, in the Shuf Mountains, just overlooking Beirut. And I befriended a Druze family there. We went to buy something at a shop. They had a shop, and he was speaking perfect English. And I spoke to him, well, how's your English? Very American sounding. He says he studies at UCLA. He came back because of the war to be with his family. And we became friendly. And at one point, he said to me, he said, you Israelis don't get it. I said, what are you talking about? I said, you're too nice. I said, why are you too nice? What do you mean? He said, you're at the roadblocks here. You're respectful. You don't touch our children. You don't abuse our women. I said, we're not going to do that. He said, yes. But it's beyond that. He said, the Syrians controlled this area before. Every few months, and he showed me, they had a very prominent electric pole at the entrance to the town. He said, that at the entrance? I said, yeah, everybody sees it. He says, they would come by every few months, get the first person they could, hang him on that electricity pole there, and let us know that's because we behaved. Just so you know what will happen if you misbehave. And it just stunned me because here, I never believed. When my mother told me the stories of what her family went through in Afghanistan, I said, yeah, they're exaggerating. Nobody behaves that way. And here, I'm getting an example in the 20th century at the time of how Syrians are behaving in Lebanon. So it still continues with them. And we still have to deal. So we all familiar with the stories of the Holocaust. We've all grown up with it. I've been to Auschwitz. It was amazing. Go to Auschwitz. I see the place. I felt that I'd personally been there. We're so familiar with the place. So we grew up with these stories, but they were stories. On October 7th, to every one of us, it became a reality. Even if we did not lose somebody in our families, we all know somebody. I know a young woman named Eden Gez. She was 28 years old. She was murdered at the music festival, the Nova. I know her as an 8-year-old. When I would play soccer with my friends in Ashkelon on the weekends, she would be there while her mother was cleaning house for the Sabbath. Her older brothers, who I was playing with, would watch over her. I know her since she was 8 years old. And she was murdered there for the crime of going, first off, being Jewish, and second, celebrating in the Nova. You all know. You may not remember her name, Naama Levy. You all know her because she is with those infamous photos of the young soldier being dragged out of a Jeep, pulled by her hair, obviously was defiled by the terrorists, being slapped and beaten and dragged into the back seat of a Jeep. Naama Levy to me is not that picture. Naama Levy is a friend of my daughter's. They spent the last year together before the war in a pre-military school in the south of Israel. Naama Levy is like my daughter. When I see Naama Levy, sorry.
Understandable, Danny.
When I see Naama Levy, I see my daughter. And every single one of us here have that. So to us, it's no longer stories. And to us, it is a matter of life and death right now. So that's how we continue our lives here. That's why our young men and women are so ardently in the battlefields fighting, because they know what's at stake. They know that it's not, oh, if we just put down our weapons, we'll live in peace and sing Kumbaya, my Lord. They will do what they did to the people in Be'eri, and in Nachalos, and in Ofakim, and in Sderot, and every one of the kibbutzim there, they'll do to every single one of us if given the chance. And not because we saw what they did on October 7th, it's because they say it to us today. And today, we believe them.
So I want to show you a graphic that I ran across this morning. Let me get it up here on my screen. It was in a tweet that somebody had put out, and it's from and I can't remember the publication. It's in Hebrew, and it was an assessment that was done by an intelligence group about what war in the North would look like, and there were discussions of casualties, daily casualties in the North, hundreds, thousands of missiles, rockets raining down on Israel every day. And there are a lot. I mean, I think yesterday, what did they fire? 200 rockets or missiles into Haifa.
Yes.
You had the couple hundred or so ballistic missiles last week. And, with friends there, I feel I'm not there, but I feel like I'm there when it happens, because they're calling me on WhatsApp and they're showing me the missiles and everything coming in. And so for example, and I don't remember when we talked exactly after the Gaza war started, but there were some pretty dire predictions about what would happen to members of the IDF. The number of casualties were in the thousands of IDF soldiers. And every soldier death is a horrible story, but it's been much less than that in Gaza. And thus far in Lebanon, everything seems to be moving along. I think Danny Hagari, the IDF spokesperson last week, talked about 700 raids that have been conducted in Lebanon since October 8th, a year ago. And just stunning achievement after stunning achievement. So my point is this: when I was 13, there was the 67 war. And I remember my father, who's a big supporter of Israel, was just like, that's all he talked about for months. The stunning victory. Then we had the problems in 73. Then you're in Lebanon in 82. And, we have the intifadas, and we have, I don't know what you said, all the incursions and back and forth with Hamas and Gaza. Are we seeing sort of a rebirth of the 67 spirit, where Israel took it to the other side and didn't sit around and wait?
Wow, that's so much I can say about this.
Go ahead. You have the floor. So
I'm trying to think, where do I go with this? There's so much connected to it. Yes, let's start with this. The assessments were very accurate because they were piling on the weapons and they were building up the opportunity, the intent. And Iran was paying for it. Iran was developing it. These were supposed to be the proxies or the tentacles of the octopus that was supposed to take over Israel. And they were planning. They have a clock in Tehran. It has a countdown clock to the destruction of Israel, which is, according to them, supposed to happen around 2040 in about 16 years. And they were planning for this.
By the way, Danny, there's I've mentioned this a lot in the updates that I do each week, but back in February, they had a poster in Palestinian Square in Tehran that had rockets and missiles with Hebrew writing on it. And it said, "Are you ready for 2 million displaced people in the north?" Which I guess my point is, why don't we believe them when they say this?
Well, fortunately, Israel did. And under Netanyahu, they've been planning for this for over 15 years. Understanding that Iran is the threat, understanding that Hezbollah is arming itself, understanding that we have to, and so he was quietly had the Mossad and others preparing for what needs to be done. But the graph that you just showed was what would happen if they initiate an assault against Israel, or something happens in one of these rounds of exchanges, deteriorates suddenly. In many ways, and this is a point that I make to a lot of people today, it's not only the October 8th is, you can see the conviction and the spirit of the Jewish people and how we've gathered ourselves and we're able to defeat our enemies. In many ways, October 7th was a blessing in disguise. With all the pain, with all the horror that we experienced and went through, when you see today, especially now which is being released about what was being prepared by Hezbollah in Lebanon, had they initiated the attack as they had planned to do it, I don't know if Israel would have existed today. Hamas, for whatever reason it may be, and as I mentioned before, coincidence may be God's way of keeping anonymous. The coincidence that they attacked us on that day in such an horrific way that left us no choice but to eliminate them, which brought on Hezbollah joining in to help them or try to divert our attention away from it. To a large degree, that allowed us to organize, understand what we're dealing with, and as you mentioned right now, and a lot of Israelis didn't know that, deal and undermine the Hezbollah abilities, and I'm telling you even a lot more. There's a lot more going on at the moment behind the scenes, both for the protection of Israel and in other areas. I'm putting together different things. I don't, I watch on Israel television, it drives me nuts sometimes. If it's the conservative station or all the mainstream media stations.
We could trade your media for our media, and you probably would still be driven crazy. So
they're the same thing. And they're always, we're going to attack today, we're going to attack tomorrow, this is what we're going to, shut the hell up. Shut up. They don't shut up. And so I don't want to fall into that. I see different things and I have certain assumptions that a lot more is going on. And I give a lot of credit here to Benjamin Netanyahu. And there have been, first off, there's a lot of people here in Israel who don't, not the majority, by the way, don't ever misinterpret this and what you're getting on the media as being expression of the majority of Israelis support him, but even a greater majority are happy that he is the prime minister at this moment. Because a lot of the leaders and a lot of people have been comparing him to Churchill. Some have been comparing him to Bismarck and what he did with Germany as he created the German state as we know it today. I studied history. To a certain degree. I never followed through on it, but I loved history. I would, beginning of the year, I would finish the book in the first few days because I always wanted to know what was happening and how did we get to where we are today. And I tell you, 50 years, 100 years from now, next century, they'll be comparing people, great leaders, to Netanyahu. I think he's above and beyond anything because the circumstances of which he is in many ways are comparable to what Bismarck was doing, because Germany wasn't the Germany that was, as we know it, when he created it. Churchill was still the head of Britain, which was a great, until World War II, was a great world power. We're the small 9 million population country here surrounded by enemies. And he has to work his magic with different people. And unfortunately, at the moment, we have an administration that doesn't want Israel to succeed in this war. By the way, I don't want to get into politics here. They're no different than other. It's been an American attitude since after the Six-Day War to hold Israel, to restrain Israel. With all the support and everything we're getting from Americans, they still don't want us to go the whole 9 yards. So we have him running things. And as I was on radio, you hear a lot of the public were complaining, look what's going on in the north. We're getting all these missiles. People have been vacated from their homes. Why is Netanyahu not doing anything? And I sort of was pondering this, and I said, look, yeah, we're right. Why aren't we? But my work with government, I knew. And if anybody, I know Netanyahu 40 years. I knew him since I was at the consulate in New York. He was at the UN embassy. It was one floor beneath us. I know him since then. And he doesn't have friends. He has people he knows. So he knows me since then. And so I know he knows what is going on, perhaps more than anybody else. So it's either one or two things. Either we don't have the abilities to address the threats coming from Iran, obviously Iran, but from Hezbollah, or there's a lot more going on that we don't know about. And I was seeing different things happening. We took out these missiles in one day, and then there were not things that we did. He was saying that there were certain things happening in Syria in which a chemical plant was taken out. There was talk about that it was not only aircraft that took it out, there were feet on the ground, as they call it. There were soldiers on the ground who completely destroyed the facility. And apparently, and I heard that one report and several reports in Arab media, and then it disappeared. Apparently 24 Iranian Revolutionary Guards were taken prisoner. A lot of other things happening.
Now, was that up in Syria, the one that you're talking about?
Yes. And so I saw all these things happening. So listen, there's a lot more going on behind the scenes right now. And now a lot of it is coming out. So I was accurate in my assumption. So I said, look, let's trust Netanyahu. If anybody knows what he's doing, it's him. And if he's not doing anything in the north, and I know right now that we know that we've been operating, had we been at war with Hezbollah, first off, you would have gotten all those missiles that were on the graph. What they were doing over the months was slowly taking out those abilities. You couldn't have done this if we had been at war with them. You couldn't have had special forces training for special operations in Syria. You couldn't have had aircraft diverted attention to that very complex attack in Syria. You couldn't have had aircraft taking out the Houthis in Yemen, which, by the way, Yemen is further away than Iran is from Israel. So you have all these things happening. It is a very complex. I wrote an article once. You can look it up. It's in Midah magazine, where they're talking about people playing chess. And I said, yeah, Netanyahu plays chess, but he plays 3D chess. Meaning his mind is in different places at different times, and he's following everything, and he has the whole thing, the whole game, very clear. So here we're learning right now, and this is what happened with Hezbollah. We took them out before we took them out, because we rendered their abilities useless. Had it not been for what we did, and then eventually taking out the heads. And by the way, the United States did not want us to take out Nasrallah. And before we took out Nasrallah, we took down first the second tier leadership. So there's really nobody capable of replacing him. And then when they replaced him with somebody, we took him out as well.
By the way, Christian Christian Amanpour at CNN was reporting last week. I don't know if you saw this or not. That
I don't watch that.
I sometimes I follow the Cal Thomas approach to media consumption. That I get up in the morning and I read my Bible to figure out what God wants to have happen, and I read the New York Times and Washington Post and CNN to see what the other side is doing.
I know them so well, but I know what they're doing even before they know, because they don't change.
Well, she said that Nasrallah had agreed to a ceasefire just moments before he was taken out.
Well, I think he should go to Allah now and complain for not living up to the promise there.
That's right. Anyway, so in the right-wing media in the United States, we have to be honest that there is a tremendous push against Israel. It's shocking to me. And so there's this constant parade of people on these programs. I don't even know if I want to name them because I'm afraid people will go and seek them out. But the constant thing is Israel's losing. Israel's on the brink of losing. Israel has just sealed its fate. It's over for Israel. Boy, they made a big mistake by going after Nasrallah. They made a big mistake by going into Lebanon, when these people don't even know that there have been 700 raids in Lebanon in the last year to take out Hezbollah capabilities. So what's the response to this garbage, this propaganda?
I don't think I can say what the response should be, what they should go do with themselves. But I think you get it from there. I don't waste my time discussing or trying to convince them. I just curse them out. One of the reasons I lost my Instagram account was precisely because of that. And I tell you, I'm sorry I lost all the contacts I had there and all the photos I had, but I do feel good about myself doing that. But to be serious for a moment,
sure.
Look, these were the same experts that for years told us that if we I mentioned this before, if we recognize the PLO, there'll be peace. There's supposedly the PLO is the representative of the Palestinian people. All right, so who's the Islamic Jihad and who are the Hamas? How do they fit in? And if you cede territory, there'll be peace. We ceded territory. And again, I have no problem with doing this. It was worth the try. I remember I worked with the Prime Minister's office under the Labour Party when the Oslo started. I don't hide my political opinions. I thought it was silly and stupid, but I said, you know what? Maybe they're right. Maybe I've been wrong. Let's give it a chance. And I'm in government. We're seeing that they're violating it. They're taking advantage immediately. They didn't even wait a day. Arafat was smuggling in known terrorists as he came into Gaza the first time. He smuggled in a terrorist in complete violation of the agreement. It's only after Rabin threatened him that he kicked the guy out. But he did that immediately. And he also spoke in South Africa saying how, he signed this agreement because right now they have no intention of fulfilling it. Right now it's the best deal that they could get, and it helps them in the future. And we know that at that time, PLO were exiled out in Tunisia, and we brought them back into the fold. So I'm seeing all these things happening, and why are we not addressing it? Why are we not bringing it to why are we not demanding that they uphold their part of the agreement? And I was getting this, we can't expect them to do it. That's their culture. That condescending attitude, the racism of lower expectations. That's the way they are. Well, if that's the way they are tough, we don't sign agreements with them. But nobody did that. And as I said, our generation failed this generation because we weren't insistent enough. And there are many reasons and excuses for it. The media pumped it. Still, the fact of the matter is, our generation brought this upon us. And that includes all these experts and all these geniuses in the United States, and the same people who are quick to tell you, why are we giving all this money to Israel? You guys are getting so many benefits out of it. Every real military expert is coming here, reading the materials, studying what Israel is doing. First with the Gaza Strip, with its battle in how we performed and maintained combat in a civilian area, knowing that every Western military is going to have to deal with this kind of combat in the future, very similar to what they have up until now. and how Israel was able to perform this with limiting the number of civilian casualties. And now with Hezbollah, and not to mention intelligence, now what a lot of people don't know is that every experience that we gather, everything that we gain from this, sometimes with blood, in many instances as a consequence of our soldiers being killed, we studied the incident and learned how to improve our performances. All of this is shared with the Americans, especially if we're developing technology to address these things. Some of it is because of the bond between us. The other thing is that, I got this from a commander that I'm friends with who was liaison with the United States, and he was part of the engineering corps. And he said that we were able to develop some kind of, and we shared this with the Americans. And we said, look, if we had $800,000 that we could invest and we could develop this kind of, he didn't want to elaborate on what it was, that would make it perfect. And the Americans said, bring it to us. They invested $800 million in making it, because that's the United States. That's the difference between us. Americans have the abilities to do these things that we don't. We have the experience. We have the knowledge. We have the interpretation of reality in which we can address these issues. We share all of that, as we've done for years with the Americans. The tactics, the military, the performances, all these things we are providing with the Americans. And as I said, countries aren't friends with you out of the goodness of their heart. It's all interests. It's all interests. And I know that the American military and the Pentagon are really supportive and want the United States to continue supporting Israel. Many of them understand what we're dealing with, but many of them also look at it from this way. We're gaining valuable experience on the ground that the Israelis are providing us, not to mention the intelligence and the abilities that we have. And there have been close bonds between Israel and the CIA for years that we can share that with them. Sometimes it doesn't even have to be admission of something, just to share an idea and let them figure it out and go about doing it. I can say this, that the Israeli Mossad, its abilities are just like the Americans have financial abilities that are like, you have the whole world economy, and then you have the United States, which is like double and triple the entire world together. You have the world intelligence community, and double that, you have the Israeli intelligence. So we have that. But the Americans have the abilities to take that. And look, we're not hiding it. We believe that out of all the countries in the West, the United States is the only country in the West that is built and established, and its foundation is the Judeo-Christian values. And we don't take that lightly. And we understand that we share those values with the United States. It is not by, again, it's not by coincidence that the American people, a majority of the American people, and the Israelis feel that bond and understand that we have that connection.
Well, look, I know I promised to keep this to about an hour, and I've got another interview coming up, so I want to thank you. So, as Christians who support Israel and stuff, what can we do to help?
Keep doing what you're doing. I know that a lot of Christians, look, even the prayers. It's very funny. I spoke to a church in Ohio a few weeks ago, and they wanted me to speak to their congregation. So we had a Zoom, and they said, they pray for my son. They knew my son. And about half an hour before I went on the air with them, my son comes home. It surprised us. So their prayers, at least for my wife and I, were answered at that moment. So prayers, certainly, and we understand that support and that love. Be there for us. Understand, even in the greatest darkness, if you know yourselves, if you know how you would conduct yourself, regardless of what you hear around you, if you know yourself, you know us, because we're very much like you in that sense. Only we're in circumstances that if you were in our circumstances, you'd be 10 times more aggressive than we have been, and justifiably so. So if you know yourselves, you know us. Your support is tremendous. Also for our conviction that we know if the United States is with us, honestly, if the United States is with us, the American people, we know we're on the right side of right. So it's very important for us to hear that. And let your Congress people and your elected officials know where you stand, and certainly make that voice heard when your elections come up.
And remember the hostages. There's still
101 at least. We know that many of them are no longer alive, but the hostages, and I believe there's a lot happening behind the scenes with that as well, that I believe will be, we may not know the whole story if and when they are released, but I'm hoping, and there's something we carry with us. But I need to stress one last point here on that issue. If it was just a hostage situation we were dealing with in the past year, it would have been resolved to a greater degree, perhaps, within this year. But what we're engaged in right now is an existential threat, a threat to our existence here. And the hostage is an element of that. And we can't, as painful as it is, we can't sacrifice the future of the state and the future of our children for all those who at the moment are being held hostage and are the victims of this current violence.
Amen. Hey, prayers for you, prayers for safety for everyone, and stay safe, and pass along the fact that there are a lot of supporters of Israel here in the United States. So, Danny, appreciate you taking time to be with us today. And if you would hang on for just a minute, I'll say goodbye to you on the other side. Folks, remember, at 7:30 Eastern Time, I'm going to be interviewing Miri Eisen from the International Institute for Counterterrorism. We'll talk about some of the details about the war in the North and that type of thing. And Danny, again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.